friends. This is the How Prayer Works podcast. My name is Dr. Dan Bates. This podcast is where we explore how God usually answers prayer and its implications for life and ministry. Let's dive in. Well, hello again, friends. Welcome to this new episode in the How Prayer Works podcast. I am pleased to be joined today by a special guest who I will introduce in just a moment. So prayer can be described as simply talking with God. It is in its essence like a child speaking to his father, and as Jesus teaches us in the Lord's Prayer to start, Our Father who is in heaven. And of course, that is the word Abba for like daddy. We can also grow in our understanding of how prayer works and figure out the laws of prayer which the Bible speaks of. In this series of looking at spiritual tools and tests, we have so far looked at the tests of obedience, integrity, and faith. We have built on the excellent work of Dr. Robert Clinton in his book, Making of a Leader, which indicates how God puts his leaders through these steps, but we are expanding those to see how it impacts our prayer lives. In the last episode, we talked about the tests that God seemingly puts his people through who want to grow in the life of prayer. We looked at the tests of obedience, integrity, and faith as critical to our growth as intercessors. Today, we want to look at another test, and that is the test of wrestling with God. This is really profound. You see, family and ministry difficulties cause unique stress and often drive us to pray. In Genesis chapter 27 in the scriptures, we read that Jacob cheated his older brother Esau out of his rightful inheritance with the help of his mother. As we go on to Genesis chapter 32, after many years, the two brothers were scheduled to meet. Would it be a bloody reunion? There's nothing like a good family fight. In the still of the night, just before the reunion, Jacob had a wrestling encounter with someone he eventually realized is a divine being. He tells the being, I will not let you go until you bless me. The next day, Jacob and Esau meet peacefully. Well, this encounter has served as a metaphor throughout church history for praying through a prayer burden. There is a sort of wrestling until there is release and peace going forward. Usually, after a spiritual wrestling match, the prayer is answered one way or another. We see this kind of wrestling on the part of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. 3 times he asks for this cup, the cross, to be taken from him. Finally, he declares, not my will, but yours be done. Through the travail of sweating so severely that the sweat looks like drops of blood, and after the hour of prayer and the third asking, Jesus is now ready to face torture unto death, and the sins of the world would be placed on him. So it seems that in the wrestling test, the battle is won in the spiritual realms before it's seen on earth. The test comes when God puts a prayer burden on his people. Will they respond and prevail until God says, enough, the prayer is answered? Well, there's a lot to unpack in all this, and I want to introduce our special guest today to help me to do that. Dan McKinnon has been a pastor for 40 years and presently serves with Africa Inland Mission as a church mission liaison. He has served as an adjunct professor at Tyndale University. Educationally, as a Bachelor of Theology from Dalhousie University, a Master of Divinity from the University of Toronto, Knox College, and also a Doctor of Ministry degree from Fuller Theological Seminary. I've had the privilege of serving with Dan and seeing him minister in several churches in parts of Canada. So welcome again, Dan.
Thank you for having me.
And it's always interesting to me to see how prayer seems to be able to grow in intensity. And if we think of even Jesus talking about asking, seeking, knocking before the door opens, it seems to grow in those levels. And it seems like the test of wrestling with God is right at the top there. It's a unique gateway to greater blessing from God, but at a cost. Dan, can you give us any further insights in terms of your understanding of this biblical passage as it relates to Jacob and wrestling and prayer?
Well, I think if you look at Jacob's story, there's a couple of things that strike me about wrestling and prayer. And I think the first is that wrestling's born out of distress on many occasions. If you think about Jacob's story, as you mentioned, he was about to meet Esau. But prior to that, Jacob is showing evidence of stepping out in faith because as he prays to God in anticipation of meeting Esau, he says, "You told me to go back to my country and my relatives, and you'd make me prosper." So he's taking a step of faith that's pretty significant. It's also a step of faith to leave Laban. But he sent out messengers to Esau to let him know that he was coming. And those messengers come back with a very simple message:
Mm.
Esau's coming with 400 men. That doesn't sound like a family reunion that's being planned. Um, if you're Esau or if you're Jacob, you're thinking, okay, I'm in serious trouble.
Mm.
And Jacob then strategizes. He divides up his family and his possessions, his animals, his servants into two groups and sends them across the river. And so, out of the distress of that moment, then we find Jacob alone on the other side of the Jabbok River, separated from family, totally alone. And this wrestling match begins with God. And I dare say that often when we wrestle with the Lord, there's a pretty good part of it that's wrestling with ourselves too. And I think we see that a bit in Jacob. Sees,
Dan, can I just interrupt you there, excuse
sure.
me, by asking you, what do you mean by that? Some of that wrestling is with ourselves.
I think one of the things that happens as we wrestle with God is we have to wrestle with our own wants and desires, even aspects of our own character that often get sifted in the wrestling with God as
Mm.
we're dealing with Him and trying to discern His will or shake an answer out of God, as it were.
Mm.
Sometimes I think that sifting takes place in us as we wrestle with God. So there's growth happens in that way as we're working through
Mm.
all of this. So
Hmm.
I think that's part of the wrestling with God. Um,
Interesting.
and so we find Jacob persevering in prayer, sort of like the friend at midnight who has company come and he has nothing to provide for them. And of course, in that culture, it would be shame on him and shame on the community if he wasn't able to provide hospitality. And so he goes and he pleads and he pleads and pleads with a neighbor until the neighbor finally gives in. I think that's
Mm.
part of what wrestling prayer is. It's pleading with God and being determined in the asking. And
Mm.
so as Jacob perseveres in prayer, um, he wrestles with the Lord and he gets his hip touched. Um,
Mm.
and from that point on in his life, he walks with a limp. And one of the things that strikes me about that, and this is part of the sifting, um, Jacob has been used to operating in his own strength, in his own
Mm.
ingenuity, creativity, call it deception at times, because Jacob has been far from a straight arrow in his life. And there's a wrestling that happens now where he gets changed and he's no longer able to operate from a position where he can assume strength because he's now weak because of the limp he's developed.
Mhm.
And that becomes then um, the foundation for the rest of his life because he's now not operating out of his own strength and ingenuity, what he can
Mhm.
do by way of deception. Instead, he's operating out of a place of weakness and dependence on God. And
Mm.
so I think wrestling with God reminds us that we all have a limp.
Mm.
Um, and that when we come out of these places of distress, like Jacob, it forces us to our knees. It forces us to acknowledge who God is. And we think of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, as you mentioned, um, pleading with the Father for a change of will. But when the change of will isn't coming, Jesus says, okay, not my will, but yours. And that's part of the struggle sometimes in wrestling. So I think
Mm.
distress is one of the things that drives us to wrestle in prayer. I think there's another thing, and that's dissatisfaction. And by that, I mean, we're not getting something that we want. or that we believe we're even entitled to, such as claiming promises that God's given to us, and we start pleading the promises and wrestling with God in prayer in that way. There's something that we want, there's something that we think we need, and that becomes the source then of this wrestling in prayer. And so dissatisfaction becomes one of the things that then inspires wrestling with God in prayer. And I think just as easily, where sometimes we're motivated by not getting something we want or believe we should have, sometimes we're motivated by getting something we don't want and would rather not have, either for ourselves or for somebody else. So things like suffering, sickness, going through trial, difficult circumstances, they're not things we want, and they're not things we want for anybody else, but they too will drive us to our knees to wrestle with God in prayer. And so I think those are the two things I see that come out of Jacob's story, um, that motivate wrestling with God in prayer, and some of the fruit that comes out of it. Obviously, some of the fruit has to do with answered prayer, but I think some of the fruit also has to do with what God does in us as we wrestle.
Oh, thank you, Dan. That's very interesting. Can you expand for me, just upon reflection of what you said about the limp that we have carrying forward? Um,
Well, it
we think
goes,
about, sorry, go ahead.
it comes from my belief that the best leaders walk with a limp and acknowledge they have one.
Mm,
Um, I think the best leaders don't operate from a place of superiority, but a place of dependence on the Lord. And I think with Jacob, there's an obvious change that happens in his life from a place of superior strength in himself to now finding that there's one that he has to depend on. There's no way on God's green earth that Jacob should reasonably expect that Esau is going to greet him with open arms. The only
mm,
way that happens is if God has done something in the in between. And so I think that when we begin to acknowledge that we have a limp, and the way I put it is, I've got stuff, you've got stuff, we've all got stuff in our lives, and the best thing we can do for each other is help each other get our stuff to Jesus. That's part of the package of who we are as broken people living in a broken world because of sin. And so I think the best leaders are the ones who can acknowledge they've got a limp, but it doesn't limit them because they're depending on the Lord.
oh, wow, fascinating. If I take the actual mechanics of that wrestling,
Mhm.
what does it look like for you in terms of prayer?
Oh boy, well, there's a good one for me. I think that as I wrestle with God in prayer, I'm always having to deal with my motivations, and my understanding of God's will. And I guess the best example I can give of that was a number of years ago. I had an invitation to candidate at a call at a church in BC, and I had done my usual of waiting on the Lord and trying to get a sense of His will. And I had charted my verses and had a pretty good idea that I was supposed to go to BC. Got out there, candidated, preached for the call, um, loved what I saw in the church and the opportunity it represented. Um, but my wife had said to me before we left, you know, if we go to BC, we can go to BC and go through this weekend with them, but I have no peace about being in BC. She said,
Mm,
when we get out there, it's nice to visit, but to live there where you've got overcast clouds 90% of the time, that was her perspective, the mountains
mhm,
on one side and the ocean on the other. She said,
mhm,
I feel claustrophobic in
mm,
BC. And I've discovered that a lot of people, when they first move out there, feel the same way.
mm,
And so she said, we can go out and go through this, but I have no peace that this is what God's will is for us.
mm,
Well, being the good husband that I am, I totally ignored that. And we went out, preached for the call, and they had a call that was signed for me that was unanimous.
mm,
I had never seen that before.
Mm.
But as I sat down and started to wrestle through that with the Lord, and given what my wife had said to me, it became clear that I was not supposed to go and that I needed to say no to that call. But that was a moment of pretty significant wrestling where I had to deal with, okay, I read God's will wrong.
Mm.
Um, and the evidence afterward proved how accurate that was. If we had gone to BC, there were circumstances that turned up in our lives in the following year or two afterwards where we would have been totally isolated if we'd gone to BC when we would
Mm.
have needed support and care. So
Mm.
that's one of the occasions that comes to mind for me when um, wrestling with God meant that I had to deal with how I had misread God's will and had misread my own motivations. And part of the package, I have to be honest, was moving to BC. I was going to be back by the ocean. That's a big thing for a maritimer. The other thing was I was going to be close to my two closest friends at the time. And they were obviously motivating factors for me, but I missed it. And it was only in wrestling with prayer that I got to the place where I could say, okay, not my will, but yours.
Well, that's fascinating because the preparatory phase for even going out there and accepting to consider this potential call was that you had been thinking about it, praying
Mhm.
about it, reading the Bible, as you said in the last podcast about charting verses, etc. So you'd already done a number of steps, but it took that final wrestling phase almost for you to get clarity. Is that adequately
That's
representative
very
of?
accurate. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And so, how did you actually do that? Did you do the wrestling thing? Did you get by yourself? Did you join with others? How did it actually work to wrestle?
So I had a couple of weeks to deal with this, and the first thing I did was we were staying with friends for that call weekend, and their home sits right next to a park, baseball field, comfortable place for me.
Hmm.
And I went over and I sat in the bleachers alone for a while and just tried to navigate my way through this. And after a while, my friend came and sat with me on the bench and helped me hear myself because that's
Hmm.
usually helpful for me.
Hmm.
Um, and began to navigate it. And it was becoming more and more clear that I had misread things. And that was the hardest part of it all. I had never misread God's will so poorly before in my life. So that was heart wrenching. Um, but we went home from there, and it just became more and more clear that I was going to have to say no to this call. And I spent time sitting looking out at Lake Ontario by myself in the car, wrestling with this and probably arguing with the Lord and letting him hear my, but I don't want to kinds of
Hmm.
responses. And
Hmm.
eventually just submitted to it. But to be honest, it was agonizing. It was probably one of the most agonizing decisions I had to come to in my life. And again, you learn something about yourself in this.
How long did it take you to do this wrestling after that weekend?
It was at least a couple of weeks, but I think the answer was pretty clear by the time I was leaving BC. And part of then the following couple of weeks was just getting myself to the place where I could grieve the loss,
Mm.
because that's what it represented. And so that was part of the heart wrenching part of it. The other piece was just how much I had misread God's will.
Mm. So it was also a humbling experience.
Oh yeah,
Almost like the limp of Jacob, you had this
yeah,
chunk out of you, so to speak.
yeah. Well, I walked with a limp after that pretty significantly.
Interesting. Well, it made me reflect on a couple of significant times of wrestling and prayer. One was before a speaking assignment, and it meant going to another city, and I was trying to prepare. It was in a different language, which meant even more preparation, and just I had no peace, and so it was basically wrestling all night, and I was pretty exhausted. And then, but when I started the actual speaking, it was like all of a sudden the Lord showed up
Mhm.
and did what he wanted to do
Yeah.
in that particular place and time. Another one was I was on a beach with my kids and I got a phone call about a potential multi-million dollar relocation was on the brink.
Mm.
And so I had to take my kids back and just spend time alone for several hours and just wrestling and then everything seemed to work out fine.
Mhm.
But I was trying to be on vacation for a bit.
Yeah. Good luck.
Yeah, good luck on that. So, wow, that's fascinating, Dan. Why is it sometimes that you think that we may not prevail with God? Like Jacob got his wish, so to speak.
Mhm.
You didn't. So, in why is it that we come to this wrestling time and sometimes we don't get what we want, even though we've had a significant wrestle match?
Yeah. Well, I think some of it comes down to how God answers prayer. Sometimes God just plainly says, "Yes, let's go for it,"
Hmm.
and sometimes He says no. And I think sometimes when He says no, there's some other words that go with it. So the way I look at it is God answers with a yes or a no, or He sometimes answers with a slow down.
Hmm.
You're moving too fast. Um, Sometimes He answers with no, you need time to grow more. Um, and that becomes part of the process for us. And I think sometimes it's just hold on. Um, the time isn't right, and God's timing is always perfect. And I think about Daniel's prayer in Daniel 10, verses 12 to 14, where he's been pleading on behalf of the nation, and he gets response from an angel, essentially, that the angel had been detained in delivering the answered prayer. And it's a whole aspect of spiritual warfare and everything that goes with that. But sometimes holding on is just God's got perfect timing, and this isn't the right time, but hang on, be faithful, and continue what you're doing. But the answer's coming. And so I tend to look at those answers that God says yes, or He says no, or He says slow, or He says grow, or He says hold on, follow me. And I think they factor into then why sometimes we don't get the answer we're looking for. And the other side of that is God always knows what the best answer is to our prayer. We think
Hmm.
we know what the best answer is,
Hmm. Hmm.
but God knows the real answer that is the best one. And sometimes we don't get what we want because if we got what we want, it actually wouldn't be the best thing for us. Sometimes it could actually be worse for us. But in His perfect timing, His sense of what is best for us, and God always has at the beat of His heart uh, good intentions for us. Sometimes He just says, "No, this isn't the right time. Um, Hang on with me and we'll work through this." So, yeah, it's yes, no, slow, grow, or hold on, follow me.
Well, those are very helpful distinctions. Wow. Um, Another question, Dan, is about where do you see God's grace, if at all, in this
Hmm.
wrestling process?
Well, I guess my first answer to that would be that if it wasn't for God's grace, I would just be plain obliterated to start with.
Right.
Um, but I think God gives us grace in the wrestling. I mean, I go back to 1 Corinthians 10:13. He never gives us a temptation or a burden that we can't bear. Never pushes beyond our limits. Will He push us
Hmm.
beyond our comfort? Absolutely. But will
Hmm.
He push us beyond our limits? No. And I think that's part of the answer to this sometimes is that um, God has His best intentions for us, and He's working
Hmm.
those out. And it's about just waiting and staying close.
And what application do you see this for church life? You've spent 40 years as a pastor.
Mhm.
You've seen all kinds of everything that could
Yeah.
happen. You've probably seen. How would you see this wrestling aspect of prayer as it relates to church life?
Well, there's some aspects that you wrestle over a short period of time, and some you wrestle with over a lifetime.
Mm,
Um, since I became a follower of Jesus, the Lord kind of impressed on me to begin to pray for revival in Canada, in the church.
mm,
And
mm,
I've been praying for revival in the church in Canada for now 40 plus years.
mm,
Have there been places and times when there's been sparks? Yeah, absolutely. But never a nationwide revival. And that's what I've been praying for. So I'm always wrestling in that regard for something and have been over the course of my whole life.
mm,
But some other aspects of this would be I'll give you some examples. Um, the first day I arrived at um, our church here in Orleans to preach, I arrived at the church about 8 o'clock in the morning. And as I walked up to the doors, I could see a message that was written on the door. And it was fairly apparent it was written in blood. Um,
yeah.
and the message was not a blessing.
Mm.
Somebody had written a curse on the door.
Oh my
And
goodness.
that's what greeted me as I entered the building that day. And so immediately I went to prayer because I was used to that kind of thing in my ministry in Scarborough. Um, and it
Mm,
became a matter of praying and wrestling and inviting others to pray and wrestle um, and for protection of the church and for the ministry because
mm,
I was about to start.
mm.
And that's not how we wanted to start was with that kind of thing. So
No.
um, I've had many occasions with things like that where you something happens or a message is delivered that just inspires you wrestling in prayer for the protection of the church. And certainly many times I've done the Joshua thing of walking around the church 7 times, just interceding on behalf of the congregation or wrestling, walking through the sanctuary, touching every chair and seeing the people who usually sit them because people are creatures of habit and just
Mm,
praying God's blessing on the people who would sit in those chairs. Those are
mm,
all practical aspects of um, wrestling in prayer. And
mm,
maybe one last one that I would give would be when we were doing leadership conferences in South India. Um, we were speaking from, there was a team of two of us who were teaching, and we would teach from 9 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night,
mm,
alternating every hour or two. And this one particular evening, as my teammate was teaching, I could see the floor covered in serpents, and I knew that there weren't actual serpents on the floor, but it represented
mm,
to me that there was spiritual warfare going on around us, and we could hear
mm,
um, the sounds and the sirens of um, Hindu temples and mosques not far from us. And my conclusion was that there were curses being projected against us. There was a spiritual attack that was being projected against us. And so while the other teammate was speaking, I just went into intercession,
mm,
both for him and intercession for the team and for the people who were attending the conference.
mm,
And I asked the guy who was speaking afterwards about what he sensed while he was teaching. And he said, well, when we first started out, it was like slugging through cement.
mm,
And then he said, all of a sudden things lifted. And that was the
mm,
point at which I had begun to pray for what I was seeing. Um,
mm,
so there's times when um, intercession in the church, wrestling, becomes very significant, I think. Um, and I mean, corporately and individually, these things are often inspired by, like I say, distress
mm,
or
mm,
dissatisfaction, some
mm,
need that rises.
mm. Oh, thank you, Dan. Yes, I recall one one meeting in a large Canadian city where I was invited to attend, and there was supposed to be a speaker, and I really felt strongly that I should not attend, but rather should intercede for this situation,
Mhm.
and so I left, and went outside and walked on the big city skyscrapers and just prayed. And it was quite a wrestling match. But anyway, then there was an experience of release, and I was totally spent, so I went home. And afterwards, I found out that there was a tremendous breakthrough.
Mm.
And one leader said he had never seen anything like it. So obviously, my role was to try
Yeah.
and prepare the way
Yeah.
for God to do whatever He wanted to do. Dan, last question: what encouragement would you give to anybody who is going through a time of wrestling in prayer?
Well, I think I would start with the smartest thing I ever did in ministry was invite a group of people to be personal intercessors for me, people who would make a
Mm,
commitment to pray for me every day and for our
mhm,
ministry.
mhm,
When we were in Bob Cajun, God moved in our church in a powerful way. There was a
mm.
sense of holiness that descended every time we worshiped.
Wow.
One lady said to me, I'm not coming to this church anymore because every time I walk in the sanctuary, I feel like crying. She said, till you
Hmm.
guys start putting Kleenex in the pews, I'm not coming anymore. Um, and for a while, I thought it had something to do with me and what I was
Oh.
doing in ministry. But I
Mhm,
realized that it was really more a result of the ladies' prayer group who every Wednesday morning prayed for
mm,
me and prayed for
mm,
our ministry. And that, I think, was what ignited that spirit of holiness in the congregation that impacted so many people. So
mm,
that would be the first thing I would say is surround yourself with people who will pray for you. And
mm,
I guess in reference to just my own wrestling, um, it's it's always the struggle to try and separate what's my will from God's will,
hmm,
and just to have a discerning heart about what I'm praying for, what I'm wrestling with or wrestling for.
mm,
Um, if we could pray to have discerning hearts,
mhm.
um, that what might make the intercession a little bit more simple for us.
Wow, thank you, Dan. This has been rich, and for me personally, it's been an encouragement, but also a real challenge. So I look forward to as we continue to unpack as we've gone through the series on spiritual tests, and then we're going to be transitioning to spiritual tools and how God helps us, He equips us, given His things. And next time, Dan will be our guest as we look at unpacking God's promises and praying with God's word as we continue to learn about how God works in this prayer podcast. So thanks so much, Dan. It's been rich, and we look forward to next time.
Thank you for having me.
Take care.